At my father's funeral, my stepmother pointed at the door. "Remove that woman. She is not his daughter." My stepsister grinned and whispered, "Then she gets nothing." Nobody defended me. Suddenly, the lawyer opened a black envelope, faced my stepmother, and said, "Your husband left exact instructions for this very moment." My stepmother pointed at me across my father's casket and said, "Remove her. She was never his daughter." The chapel went dead silent. I heard the air conditioner click on above the doors, that soft mechanical sigh. And somehow that was the sound I remember most clearly from the worst moment of my life. Nobody moved. Nobody looked at me. Not one uncle, not one cousin, not one of Dad's old golf buddies who used to clap me on the shoulder and call me the smart one. 40, maybe 50 people, and every single one of them found somewhere else to put their eyes. My stepsister Brooke stood beside her mother in a black designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, smiling like she'd already won something. That means she gets nothing. I was 31 years old, standing in the only black dress I owned, bought 4 years ago for a coworker's mother's funeral, one hand still resting on the cool wood of my father's casket because I hadn't been able to make myself stop touching it. He'd been dead 3 days. Eleanor waited until the chapel was packed, every folding chair full, people standing along the back wall, to say it. Not at home, not in the car on the way here, not in some private moment where I could have absorbed it and fallen apart quietly. Here, in front of everyone he loved, in front of the minister who was still holding his notes for the eulogy he hadn't finished delivering. "Say that again," I told her. My voice didn't shake. I remember being surprised by that. "You were a charity case," Eleanor snapped, loud enough that it echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "He felt sorry for you. That's not blood." My hands were shaking, even if my voice wasn't. Not from fear. From 20 years of biting my tongue at every holiday, every birthday, every single time she'd called me Harold's little project behind a smile thin enough to see through. An usher, a heavy-set man in a gray suit who worked for the funeral home and had no idea what he'd just walked into, grabbed my elbow. "Ma'am, let's step outside." I pulled away hard enough that he stumbled back a step. "Don't touch me." That's when Mr. Bell stood up. "I need to back up because none of this makes sense unless you understand who I am and how I got into that dress in that chapel in the first place. I'm a title examiner. Have been for 9 years. First at a small firm in Ohio, and then, for the last 5, at a national underwriting office where I spend my days reading deeds, easements, liens, and trust documents for a living. I tell you this not because it's interesting, it isn't most days, but because it matters later. Everything about how this story ends comes down to the fact that I know how to read a document that other people skim past. My father, Harold Whitaker, was 68 when he died. Heart attack, sudden, in his study on a Tuesday evening, while he was supposedly reviewing insurance paperwork. My aunt found him. He'd been widowed once. My biological mother, Diane, died of ovarian cancer when I was 7, and remarried when I was 11 to a woman named Eleanor Voss, a recently divorced real estate broker with a daughter, Brooke, who was 9 at the time. For 20 years, I called Eleanor Eleanor, never Mom. That wasn't hostility on my part. Not at first. It was just true. And everyone in that house seemed to understand it as true, including her. What I did call eventually was my father, Dad. I remember the exact day. I was 11 and a half, about 5 months into the marriage, and he'd picked me up from a Girl Scouts thing in the rain because Eleanor had forgotten, and I said it without thinking. "Thanks, Dad." And then I panicked and hid in the pantry for 20 minutes because I thought I'd done something wrong, like I'd stolen a word that wasn't mine to use. He came and found me. Didn't say anything about it directly, just sat down on the pantry floor next to me in his work clothes and asked if I wanted to help him make popcorn. I didn't know until 3 days before his funeral that he'd gone home that same week and started the paperwork to legally adopt me. That's the part Eleanor spent 20 years pretending never happened. The signs that something was wrong started small, the way they always do. I told myself it was nothing over and over for years because the alternative, that my father's wife genuinely resented my existence in his life, was too exhausting to sit with when I was 14, then 18, then 25. First loop. When I was 14, Eleanor redid the family photo wall in the front hallway. Every photo of my mother, Diane, disappeared. Not thrown away. I found them years later in a box in the garage, water damaged from a roof leak nobody had bothered to fix, but simply gone from the wall, replaced with photos of Eleanor's side of the family and school portraits of Brooke. I asked my father about it once. He said quietly, "Eleanor likes things fresh." I told myself it was nothing, just decorating. I didn't yet understand that erasure is also a kind of decorating. Second loop. When I turned 18, there was a dispute about my college fund, a 529 account my mother had set up before she died, meant explicitly for me. Eleanor argued in front of my father that family money should go to family priorities, and pushed for some of it to be redirected toward a car for Brooke, who was turning 16. My father refused. I remember the fight through the bedroom wall, low voices that got sharp at the edges, and the next morning Eleanor was perfectly pleasant at breakfast, like nothing had happened. I told myself that was normal marriage stuff, grown-up disagreements, nothing to do with me, even though it was entirely about me. Third loop. At 23, my grandmother, my mother's mother, passed and left me a modest inheritance, about $40,000. Eleanor suggested more than once over the following year that I should invest it with Harold and me in a rental property she was managing. I declined gently, and she stopped speaking to me for 6 weeks. My father apologized to me privately for her behavior. He never once asked me to reconsider giving Eleanor the money. Looking back, that's one of the clearest proofs I have of who he actually was. Fourth loop. At 27, my father had a minor cardiac event, not the one that killed him, an earlier warning shot, a stent procedure, and a hospital stay. I flew in and sat with him every day. Eleanor visited twice, for maybe 20 minutes each time, dressed for something else both times, like she had somewhere better to be. Brooke didn't visit at all. I remember sitting in that hospital chair at 2 a.m., my hands cold, watching the monitor and thinking, if he dies, I am going to be alone in this family in a way I don't yet have words for. I tried to raise it with him once he recovered, gently, not wanting to burn anything down, and he changed the subject, the way people do when they already know something is true and aren't ready to look at it directly. Fifth loop, 6 months before he died, my father asked me to meet him for lunch, just the two of us, which had become rare, at a diner near his office. He seemed distracted, kept checking his phone, and near the end of the meal, he said something I didn't understand at the time and have relayed 1,000 times since. Ava, whatever happens, I need you to trust that I saw this coming. All of it. I asked him what he meant. He said, I'll explain when it matters, and paid the check, and that was that. I told myself it was nothing. A stressed man, a stressed lunch. I had no idea he was already 6 weeks into moving his entire estate into an irrevocable trust, or that he'd already met twice with Mr. Bell to finalize a document that would only be opened if the worst version of Eleanor showed up at his funeral. He knew her. That's the part that still gets me. 20 years married to her, and he knew exactly what she'd do the second he was gone, and he built a legal structure specifically to survive it. Mr. Bell, Warren Bell, my father's attorney for over 25 years, silver-haired, 71 years old, still practicing because, in his words, retirement sounds like death with paperwork, walked to the front of the chapel with a cane he genuinely needed and a calm that made the ushers nervous in a way I found almost funny, given the circumstances. He'd been my father's estate and business attorney since before I was adopted, had drafted 3 separate wills over the decades as circumstances changed, and had a reputation in the local bar association, I would later learn, for being nearly impossible to rattle. He pulled a black envelope from the inside pocket of his suit jacket, sealed in red wax, the old-fashioned kind, pressed with what I'd later learn was my father's own signet ring, a thing he'd worn every day of my life and that I'd genuinely never once asked about. Eleanor's face went white. Your husband left instructions for this exact moment, Mr. Bell said. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. The whole room had already gone quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when they sense a shift they don't understand yet. Brooke's smile dropped. He broke the seal. Read it out loud in the flat, careful cadence of a man who has read a lot of legal documents aloud in his career and has learned not to editorialize with his tone. If Eleanor tries to remove Ava from my funeral, stop the service and open the second envelope in front of everyone. He reached into his coat again. Eleanor screamed, "Don't you dare!" He didn't flinch. In 9 years of reading legal documents for a living, I have never seen anyone deliver a sentence with less visible effort and more total authority. Sit down, Mrs. Whitaker. My husband just died. You don't get to order me around. These aren't your guests, he said, gesturing very slightly at the packed room. They're witnesses. The word hit the room like a slap. I watched 3 people in the second row physically straighten in their seats. He opened the second envelope. Eleanor lunged toward him so hard she caught the edge of the flower stand beside the casket, and it tipped, white lilies scattering across the carpet, water soaking into the runner. Brooke grabbed her mother's arm, not to comfort her, to shut her up, hard enough that I saw Eleanor wince. Mr. Bell looked at me. His voice softened in a way that made my throat close up. Ava, your father wanted you to hear this publicly. He knew they'd try to erase you privately. He read. My father had written that he'd legally adopted me before I turned 12. The process had actually started that same week with the popcorn and the pantry, though the paperwork took 11 months to finalize through the county family court. He wrote that the adoption decree was filed, sealed, and stored in 3 separate places: the county courthouse, Mr. Bell's office safe, and a fireproof lockbox at our family bank, because he'd told Mr. Bell, in writing 12 years ago, a note Mr. Bell had kept in the file the entire time, that he suspected Eleanor would one day try to pretend the adoption had never happened. He wrote that blood is biology, that fatherhood is a decision he made every single morning for 20 years, starting the day I called him dad for the first time and then hid in the pantry, terrified he'd be angry. He wasn't angry. He wrote that it was the best day of his life. Someone behind me started crying. My Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, who had flown in from Arizona and had been sitting rigid and silent through all of this until that exact sentence broke her. Brooke snapped, "That doesn't change the estate." "Actually," Mr. Bell said, not even glancing at her, "it changes everything." He told the room that my father had moved his entire estate, a house, 2 rental properties, his 401k, a life insurance policy worth $850,000 and roughly $1, $2 million in a brokerage account, into an irrevocable family trust 6 months prior, named me sole trustee, effective the day he died. Eleanor's mouth fell open. "That's not possible. Harold would never cut me out." "He didn't cut you out of love," Mr. Bell said. "He cut you out of control." Brooke's face went red, blotchy at the neck, the way people get when they're too angry to manage their own faces anymore. "This is insane. She's not even really his." "That's enough, Brooke," Mr. Bell said. But it was too late. Eleanor had already found her opening, and she took it with the kind of speed that told me she'd been waiting for one. Eleanor's grief mask, which had cracked once already at the casket, finished shattering right there in front of 50 witnesses. She stepped toward me, eyes burning, mascara starting to streak, though I genuinely could not tell you if any of the tears were real. "You think you won? You don't even know what he found out about your mother." Mr. Bell's voice sharpened for the first time. "Careful." "No," Eleanor said, smiling through her teeth in a way I will remember until the day I die. "She wants the truth. Let her have it." She pointed straight at the casket, her voice pitched to carry to the back pews. "Your precious father was about to cut you off too, Ava. He knew you weren't his blood. He just died before he could fix the paperwork." Someone gasped. My aunt covered her mouth. A woman I didn't recognize recognize, maybe one of Eleanor's friends, actually stood halfway up out of her seat before sitting back down. The room went silent enough that I could hear my own pulse in my ears, a dull thudding that felt disconnected from the rest of my body, like I was watching this happen to someone else from 3 feet outside myself. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just looked at Mr. Bell. He didn't move. He didn't speak right away. He just held the second envelope's contents at his side, his face giving nothing away, like a man who already knew exactly how this moment was supposed to end, and it hadn't started yet. Then he did something I wasn't expecting. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a third item. Not an envelope this time. A single folded sheet of paper, laminated, the way you'd protect something you needed to survive years of handling. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "I'd like you to reconsider what you just said, because your husband anticipated you'd say exactly that too." Here is where I have to explain something that even I didn't fully understand until 3 weeks later, sitting in Mr. Bell's office with a forensic accountant and a genetic counselor, going through documents that made my hands go cold every time I picked them up. My father had, in fact, ordered a paternity test. Eleanor wasn't lying about that part. That's what made it so effective as a weapon in the moment. He'd ordered it 8 months before he died, quietly, through a private lab, after Eleanor had spent years making the same accusation in smaller, meaner ways. Comments about how I didn't look like Harold, how my mother always kept secrets, little seeds planted at Thanksgiving dinners over 15 years, designed, I now believe, to soften the ground for exactly this moment. He never told me he'd done it. That's the part that hurt the most when I first learned it, before I understood why. The results came back 3 months before his death. He was, in fact, my biological father. Confirmed, 99.97% probability, from a lab called Meridian Genomics with full chain of custody documentation. He hadn't shared it with me because, and this is in his own handwriting, in a letter Mr. Bell hadn't opened yet, tucked in a separate file. He didn't want me to ever know the accusation had gotten far enough into his head that he'd felt the need to test it. He was ashamed of having doubted it for even the length of time it took to mail a cheek swab to a lab. He'd ordered the test not because he believed Eleanor, he wrote, but because he wanted a piece of paper that could shut her up permanently, for my sake, so I'd never have to hear this exact speech from her without an answer already sitting in a file. He just never got to give me the answer himself. Eleanor knew about the test. She'd found out, we'd learn later, through her own admission under oath, because she'd gone through his study while he was at a doctor's appointment and found the lab correspondence. What she didn't know, because she'd only found the order confirmation and not the results, was that the test had already come back and had come back in my favor, weeks before my father died. She'd spent his funeral gambling on a result she'd never actually seen. Mr. Bell unfolded the laminated sheet. It was a letter-sized summary page from Meridian Genomics, the kind of clean, official document I'd recognize instantly from my own work, reviewing chain of custody paperwork on title claims, case number, collection dates, lab certification numbers, a results table with a probability of paternity field filled in with more decimal places than any layperson would think to include. "Your husband received these results 11 weeks before his death," Mr. Bell said. "He asked me to hold a certified copy specifically in case you attempted to use the test itself as a weapon, because he told me," and this is a direct quote I wrote down in my own file notes at the time, "Eleanor will find out I ran the test and use the fact that I ran it, even after she finds out what it says. He knew you'd do exactly this. He told me so 11 weeks before he died, sitting in my office." He held it up. Not close enough for anyone to grab, just high enough for the room to see the letterhead. "Ava Whitaker is Harold Whitaker's biological daughter, confirmed by DNA analysis, ordered by Harold himself, received and read by Harold himself 3 months before his passing. He knew the truth for the last quarter of his life and chose, every day of it, to keep treating Ava exactly as he always had, as his daughter, full stop, no modifier." Eleanor made a sound I can only describe as air leaving something. Brooke's hand slid off her mother's arm. "He never told me the results came back," Eleanor said, and for the first time in 20 years, I watched her say something that sounded less like a performance and more like something true slipping out involuntarily. "He said he was still waiting. He lied to you about that specifically," Mr. Bell said, "because he suspected you'd try to use even a pending test against Ava, and he was right, because you just did it with a test whose results you never actually saw. I want to tell you the crisis peak of this story was the funeral itself, but it wasn't. The funeral was the detonation. The crisis peak came 9 days later, when Eleanor's attorney filed an emergency petition to contest the trust, freeze the estate accounts, and, this is the part that still makes my stomach drop when I think about it, filed a companion motion requesting the county reopen and review my adoption decree in light of newly discovered information regarding biological parentage, attaching Eleanor's sworn declaration repeating the funeral accusation as if it were established fact, rather than something already disproven in a document she'd stood next to. I had 72 hours to respond before a hearing that could, in theory, freeze trustee access to funds needed to cover the mortgage on my father's house, the property taxes on the rental units, and a maintenance issue on one of the rentals that a tenant had already threatened to escalate to the city if not addressed within the week. My own job required me at my desk 5 days a week reviewing other people's title chains while my own family's estate sat exposed to a legal challenge built on a lie its own architect had never bothered to verify. I didn't sleep the second night. I remember sitting at my kitchen table at 2:47 a.m. with the trust documents spread out in front of me, doing the thing I do professionally, reading every line, checking every date, cross-referencing every reference number, except this time it was my own father's handwriting in the margins of an early draft, and my hands wouldn't stop stopped shaking badly enough that I had to set my coffee mug down twice. Mr. Bell called me that morning. "We're not going to fight this reactively," he said. "We're going to fight it with documentation so complete that continuing becomes professionally embarrassing for opposing counsel." That's when the institutional wall really went up around me, 3 people at a time. The first was Detective Renata Cole, 17 years with the County Sheriff's Department, the last 9 in financial and elder fraud investigations, not because anyone had called the police on Eleanor yet, but because Mr. Bell, reviewing my father's financial records in preparation for the hearing, found 6 transfers totaling $94,000 out of a joint checking account he and Eleanor had shared, moved into an account solely in Eleanor's name, executed in the 11 days between my father's death and his funeral, before the trust's freeze provisions had technically activated. Detective Cole was blunt in our first meeting. "This looks like someone who knew a window was closing and sprinted through it." She opened a case file. The transfers were documented with timestamps, account numbers, and a paper trail Eleanor's own bank had preserved without needing to be asked twice, because banks, it turns out, keep excellent records specifically for situations like this. The second was Ria Nakamura, a forensic accountant Mr. Bell had worked with on estate disputes for over a decade, brought in specifically to trace every dollar that had moved through any account connected to my father in the 18 months before his death. She's the one who found that Eleanor had also, 4 months before Dad died, taken out a $60,000 home equity line of credit against a rental property that was solely in my father's name, using a power of attorney document my father had signed years earlier for a much narrower, unrelated purpose, and that Eleanor had apparently kept active and used far beyond its original scope. Priya's report ran to 41 pages, with exhibits lettered A through P, and included a line I read probably a dozen times. The pattern of transfers is inconsistent with routine household management and consistent with anticipatory extraction of assets in advance of a known health decline. The third was Dr. Marcus Felt, my father's cardiologist for the 6 years since his first cardiac event, who, when subpoenaed for records related to the estate dispute, produced something none of us had known existed: a note from a visit 4 months before Dad's death, in which my father had told him, unprompted, "If anything happens to me suddenly, I want you to know I've documented my intentions carefully, because my wife and I don't see eye to eye on some things, and I don't want confusion afterward." Dr. Felt had noted it in the chart specifically because it struck him as an unusual thing for a patient to say, and doctors, it turns out, sometimes write down the unusual things. The fourth, brought in specifically for the adoption question Eleanor's petition had reopened, was Dr. Lena Ashworth, a forensic document examiner with a specialty in legal record authentication. She confirmed what Mr. Bell already knew but needed independently verified for the court. My adoption decree, filed with the county family court 20 years earlier, was authentic, properly executed, and had never been amended, appealed, or challenged in 2 decades, meaning Eleanor's petition to reopen, it wasn't actually a reopening of anything. It was an attempt to manufacture a legal question that had been permanently settled before Brooke had even finished elementary school. Some of the people I encountered through this process doubted me, at least initially. A clerk at the county courthouse, pulling the adoption file, asked me twice if I was sure I wanted to proceed, in a tone that suggested she'd seen enough contested estates to assume the worst about everyone involved by default. A mediator in an early settlement conference gently suggested I consider a compromise distribution to preserve family relationships, a suggestion I found almost funny given that the family relationship in question had just tried to erase me at my father's casket. But once the documentation was in front of them, the trust language, the DNA results, the adoption decree, Priya's 41 pages, Detective Cole's timeline of transfers, every one of them changed their tone within the same meeting. That shift, watching someone's professional skepticism convert into quiet certainty once they actually read the paper, was its own strange kind of vindication. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in the county probate court, Judge Okonkwo Reyes presiding, a woman with a reputation, Mr. Bell told me, for having zero patience for theater, and even less for badly sourced motions. Eleanor's attorney, a younger man named Griffin Pace, who'd clearly been retained on short notice and hadn't yet learned what he was working with, opened by reasserting the parentage question and requesting the estate freeze remain in place pending further investigation. Mr. Bell stood and in under 6 minutes walked the court through the Meridian Genomics report, Dr. Ashworth's authentication of the adoption decree, and a brief, devastating aside noting that opposing counsel's own client's sworn declaration referenced a paternity test whose actual results, favorable to my position, had been in her attorney's possession for 11 days before the petition was filed, meaning the petition had been submitted with knowledge that directly contradicted its central claim. Judge Okonkwo Reyes looked up from the documents for the first time since Mr. Bell began. "Mr. Pace, did your client disclose to you that these results existed prior to filing?" Pace's silence answered the question for him. The judge denied the petition to reopen the adoption decree outright, calling it, in her written order, an attempt to relitigate a matter conclusively settled 20 years prior, based on a factual claim the petitioner's own evidence disproves. She lifted the freeze on trust assets, citing my documented conduct as sole trustee, every dollar accounted for, every rental maintenance issue addressed on schedule, the mortgage current. As evidence, the trust was being administered exactly as my father intended. Separately, and more slowly, the criminal side moved forward. Detective Cole's case, built on Priya's forensic accounting, led to formal charges against Eleanor for financial exploitation and misuse of a power of attorney instrument, the $60,000 home equity line drawn against a property she had no legal authority to encumber. She ultimately entered a plea agreement rather than go to trial. Restitution of the full $60,000 plus the $94,000 in post-death transfers, 5 years of probation, and a permanent bar from ever serving as a fiduciary, trustee, or power of attorney holder for any estate in the state. Her real estate broker's license, which required disclosure of the plea in a renewal filing 8 months later, was suspended pending a state licensing board review that, as of this writing, has not yet concluded but seems unlikely to end well for her. Brooke faced no criminal exposure. She hadn't touched any accounts, but the trust litigation surfaced enough of her own text messages, subpoenaed as part of discovery, that her fiancé at the time called off their engagement roughly 6 weeks after the hearing. I don't know the exact contents of what he read. I only know that a mutual acquaintance mentioned months later that he'd told people he couldn't unsee it and left it there. I've chosen not to ask further. Some closures don't need my curiosity attached to them. It's been 14 months now. I still work as a title examiner. I still read documents for a living, cross-referencing dates and names and chains of custody, and I don't think I'll ever again do that job without some quiet part of my brain remembering that the most important document I ever read was one my own father wrote in his own hand, specifically anticipating a moment he wouldn't live to see but somehow understood completely anyway. I sold the house. I couldn't live in it, not with the memory of that pantry doorway and everything after. But I kept one thing, the popcorn bowl, a plain ceramic one, nothing special, that had sat in the same kitchen cabinet for 20 years. It sits on my counter now. I use it more than is probably reasonable for a grown woman living alone. Eleanor and I have not spoken since the plea hearing. Brooke sent one email 4 months ago that I read twice and have not answered. I'm not certain I ever will. Some doors don't need to be slammed shut. They just quietly stop being doors. The trust still funds a small scholarship, something I set up in my father's name at the community college near our old house, for adult students returning to finish a degree later than planned, because that's what he always said he wished he'd done differently in his own life, and because it felt like the right use of money that had, in the end, become less about wealth and more about proof of a decision he'd made every morning for 20 years, long before any lab confirmed what he already knew in every way that actually mattered. Blood is biology. He was right about that. But he taught me in the end that it was never really the point.